The story of Arizona Donnie Barker doesn't begin with gun smoke or the crack of a Tommy gun. It begins with dust. Thick, sunburnt dust that clung to your boots, your breath, your bones. The kind of dust that coated every dream and made survival itself feel like rebellion. Out there, in the tired fields of Ash Grove, Missouri, the air was heavy with struggle. And standing right in the middle of it was a wiry girl named Arizona Donnie Clark, sharp-eyed, tough-skinned, and already too stubborn for the quiet life that surrounded her. She was born in 1873, the daughter of a farmer who wrestled more with fate than with crops. The world she knew was hard and unforgiving, and it raised her the same way. People said she had a way of looking at you, steady and unflinching, as if she already knew the kind of person you were. There was no luxury, no comfort, and little mercy in those parts. By the time she was a teenager, Arizona had learned that if you wanted something, you didn't ask politely, you took it, or you went without. She married early, like most women in those days did, chasing stability more than love. George Barker, a poor farmer and occasional laborer, was the man who gave her his name, but never much more. Together they had 4 sons, Herman, Lloyd, Arthur, and Fred, the Barker boys. And whether she meant to or not, Arizona, now called Ma, was about to raise more than a family. She was about to raise a legend. Life in the Barker household wasn't about right and wrong. It was about getting by. George was often gone, drifting between odd jobs, chasing wages that vanished before they mattered. Ma Barker, on the other hand, ruled her little kingdom with the kind of strength only desperation could forge. She was loud when she needed to be, soft when it counted, and unbending when it came to her boys. In those years, the country itself was changing. The old frontier was dying, replaced by factories, machines, and men in suits who spoke of progress while families like the Barkers scraped by on next to nothing. Outlaws and bank robbers weren't just criminals. They were symbols of defiance, folk heroes for the ones left behind. Ma Barker didn't know it yet, but the world was getting ready for her kind of story. By the time her sons were old enough to roam, the trouble had already started. Petty thefts, car thefts, bar fights. Every time a Barker boy got picked up, Ma would show up at the sheriff's door, fierce and unyielding. She'd talk her way into leniency, plead, threaten, or charm, whatever it took. In her mind, her boys could do no wrong. Neighbors whispered that she spoiled them rotten. Police said she encouraged them. But Ma saw herself as their shield against a world that had never given her a fair shot. She was, in her own strange way, a mother of principle. Twisted perhaps, but real. Family came first, always. There was something magnetic about the Barkers. They weren't educated, they weren't rich, but they had nerve. And nerve counted for a lot back then. The Barker boys drifted in and out of reform schools, learning more about crime than correction. Each time one came home, Ma's arms were open and her table was set. It didn't matter what they'd done. To her, they were still her babies, boys she'd nursed through hunger, through sickness, through winters that bit harder than bullets ever would. Somewhere between motherly love and moral blindness, Ma Barker began to blur the lines. She didn't hold a gun or rob a bank herself, but she didn't have to. Her devotion became their permission. Her loyalty became their license. In those long Midwest nights, when the wind rattled the loose boards of their farmhouse, she'd tell her sons stories, not from books, but from life. She talked about men who'd wronged her, about bosses who cheated her, about the world that looked down on poor families like theirs. And she'd always end with the same lesson. Don't ever let anybody tell you what you're worth. To the Barkers, that wasn't just advice, it was scripture. The turn of the century came and went, and so did George Barker. Some said he left because he couldn't handle the noise, the chaos, the boys' growing wildness. Others said Ma pushed him out. Either way, when he was gone, Arizona Donnie Barker didn't break down. She took charge. She gathered her sons, looked each one in the eye, and told them the truth. They were on their own now. The family would have to fend for itself, and so they did, one petty crime at a time. By the 1920s, America was roaring. Jazz in the cities, moonshine in the backwoods, and opportunity in the shadows. For a new breed of criminal, the Midwest was wide open. Trains, banks, and rich men's cars, all ripe for the taking. The Barker boys fit right in. Herman became the daring one, handsome, reckless, and always armed. Lloyd worked the scams. Arthur handled the muscle. And Fred, the youngest, was Ma's favorite, the one who seemed to carry her spirit in his bones. Ma followed them from town to town, never far behind. She rented houses under false names, cooked them meals, washed their clothes, and kept their stories straight. Some said she was just a mother trying to keep her family together. Others said she was the mind behind their moves, the quiet voice that told them when to strike and when to vanish. Truth? Probably somewhere in between, but if you looked closely, really looked, you'd see something else in her eyes. A mix of pride and fear. Pride for the sons who'd made names for themselves. Fear for the monsters they were becoming. She knew each new heist, each new headline brought them closer to the edge. But she couldn't stop. Maybe she didn't want to. The love that had once protected them had turned into the thing that bound them to ruin. There's an old saying in the Midwest: the river gives, and the river takes. For Ma Barker, that river was fate. It had carried her from a dusty childhood to the doorstep of infamy. And though she didn't know it yet, the current was only just beginning to rise. When night fell over the heartland and the sirens began to echo through the farmlands, Ma Barker sat by her window, waiting. Always waiting. She'd light a cigarette, watch the road, and think about the choices that had brought her here. She wasn't the kind of woman who dreamed of riches or revenge. All she ever wanted was control. Control over her life, her boys, her destiny. But control is a fragile illusion in a world built on sin and survival. In the quiet before the storm, she remained just a mother, a woman with cracked hands and a steel heart trying to hold together a family. That was already halfway to hell. The newspapers would one day call her the most dangerous woman in America. But back then, in those early days of struggle and survival, she was something simpler and perhaps more tragic. She was a mother who loved too fiercely in a world that didn't love her back. And soon, that love would ignite a fire the FBI would spend years trying to put out. If you want to understand how the Barker name became legend, you have to start with the creed that ran through their blood like moonshine: family first. It wasn't a slogan, not a motto. It was law. By the time the 1920s rolled in, the Barker boys had grown from restless delinquents into full-blooded outlaws. The country was changing fast. Speakeasies, bootleggers, and bank robbers were the new aristocracy of the underworld. Lawmen were underpaid, the public was angry. And in those smoky years of prohibition, the line between hero and villain was so thin you could drive a getaway car over it. For the Barkers, crime wasn't rebellion anymore. It was inheritance. Herman Barker was the spark. The oldest and wildest, he had charm enough to make trouble look like fun. He ran with small-time gangs in Kansas and Oklahoma, robbing stores and holding up banks that couldn't afford to be robbed. His reputation grew fast, too fast, and every headline with Barker in it sent Ma's heart pounding between pride and dread. But no matter what trouble they caused, Ma was there. She'd rent a place near whichever town her boys were hiding in, living under false names. Mrs. Clark one week, Mrs. Hunter the next. She kept her ear to the ground, cooking hearty meals for fugitives and listening to their whispered plans over chipped plates and coffee gone cold. To some, she was a mother nursing her boys through hard times. To others, she was the quiet shadow who kept them one step ahead of the law. Lloyd Barker, the second son, was the calmest of the four, but even he couldn't stay clean. He joined the army, tried for a normal life, but the pull of blood was stronger. He came back home restless, and restless men in the Midwest found work easier in crime than in honesty. Then there was Arthur, nicknamed Doc. He wasn't a doctor of anything, but he was sharp, controlled, and patient. He didn't crave chaos like Herman did. He preferred planning. He could map out a heist like a chess game, thinking 5 moves ahead while the others loaded their guns. And finally, Fred, the youngest, the one Ma favored most. He had her spirit, loyal, fiery, and stubborn to the bone. Fred Barker wasn't just another outlaw. He was her hope, her mirror, her undoing. Together, they were a storm. And every storm needs a calm center. That was Ma. She wasn't pulling triggers or breaking safes, but she was the anchor. When they needed a hideout, she found it. When they needed someone to smooth talk a landlord or a nosy neighbor, she put on her Sunday smile and played the part of the sweet, church-going widow. Behind that smile was calculation. She knew her boys weren't saints. She also knew they were too far gone to turn back, so she made a choice. If they were going to be outlaws, they'd be her outlaws. Their name began spreading from Kansas to Missouri, then to Minnesota and beyond. The Barkers weren't just thieves. They were organized, deliberate, and unnervingly close-knit. Cops started calling them the Barker Gang, but inside that circle, they were still just family around the dinner table. Every job they pulled, every escape they managed, only deepened the myth. And somewhere in the Midwest twilight, between the clatter of typewriters in police stations and the whisper of bootleg deals, people began to speak of a mother who raised gangsters, a woman who stood behind her sons, not in shame, but in quiet, burning loyalty. The truth, as always, was messier. Ma Barker wasn't some cold-blooded mastermind. She wasn't sketching blueprints of banks or dictating who to kidnap next. She was more of a symbol, the glue that kept a violent, fractured family from tearing apart. When the boys fought, she settled it. When someone got caught, she begged and bribed for mercy. When they needed to vanish, she packed their things and moved in the dead of night. She became their refuge, and eventually their excuse. The real turn came when Fred met Alvin Karpis, a name that would soon be whispered with both fear and fascination. Karpis was slick, methodical, and dangerous. Unlike most gangsters of the time, he didn't rely on luck or rage. He relied on planning and patience. When Fred brought Karpis home, Ma welcomed him like another son. She cooked him supper, washed his clothes, and listened to him talk about the business of crime. The partnership between Fred Barker and Alvin Karpis became the backbone of the Barker-Karpis Gang, one of the most feared criminal outfits of the 1930s. Kidnapping rich businessmen for ransom became their signature. It was cleaner than robbing banks and, in some ways, more profitable. They'd grab a wealthy target, hide him in a safe house, and demand payment from families too terrified to involve the police. It was bold. It was brutal. And it worked. Through it all, Ma stayed close, sometimes at the hideout, sometimes in the house next door, always within reach. She'd fuss over the men like a mother hen, cooking breakfast while they counted stacks of ransom money. The boys joked that she didn't just raise criminals, she managed them. But make no mistake, Ma knew the danger. Every success brought attention, every ransom, a new investigation. The FBI was growing stronger, and J. Edgar Hoover was building a reputation of his own, determined to crush the myth of the American outlaw. Sooner or later, he'd set his sights on the Barkers. There were moments, though quiet ones, when the mask slipped. Late at night, after the laughter faded and the whiskey ran dry, Ma would sit alone by the window, cigarette smoke curling around her. Maybe she'd remember her husband, long gone. Maybe she'd think of the little boys she used to tuck in at night before the guns and the getaways. She never spoke those thoughts aloud. The Ma Barker the world knew had no room for regret. But the woman behind her eyes, the mother, was still in there somewhere, trapped between love and guilt, power and loss. The Barkers' success couldn't last forever. Crime has a way of burning bright and fast, and every bright thing leaves a shadow. As the ransoms grew larger, so did the heat. Their names began appearing in newspapers across the Midwest, each story wilder than the last. The FBI labeled them public enemies. The public called them folk devils. But inside the safe houses and stolen cars, it was still the same rhythm. Ma cooking, Fred planning, Karpis scheming, and the others drifting in and out of the picture. Family first, crime second, always. By the early 1930s, the Barker-Karpis Gang had made millions, an unimaginable fortune for people who once lived on scraps. They bought safe houses under fake names, hid out in quiet lakeside towns, and tried to live invisible lives behind lace curtains and polite smiles. But peace never lasts long when you've built it on fear. Inside that illusion of calm, cracks were forming. Loyalties frayed, tempers boiled. The FBI was closing in, one lead at a time, and somewhere deep down, Ma Barker must have felt it, the storm coming back around. The same wind that had once carried her boys out into the world was now circling home. She'd raised her sons to survive anything. But survival, like love, comes at a price, and soon, Ma Barker would find herself paying in full. By 1932, the Barker name had become more than a family. It was a brand of fear. Whispered in police stations, cursed in the headlines, and admired in the smoky corners of speakeasies where desperate men dreamed of striking rich the illegal way. The Midwest was bleeding with opportunity for those bold enough to take it. Banks were weak, law enforcement spread thin, and the Great Depression had turned good men into gamblers of survival. Amid that chaos, the Barker-Karpis Gang thrived, half ghost story, half crime empire, and at the center of it all sat a small, gray-haired woman with a sharp tongue and a steady gaze, Ma Barker. They moved like smoke, never staying in one place too long. Minnesota one week, Illinois the next. Their hideouts were rented under fake names, often quiet houses in ordinary neighborhoods where no one would suspect the walls hid fugitives. Ma was always the face at the door, polite, motherly, harmless. "Mrs. Clark," she'd say with a smile, "just me and my boys passing through." The neighbors saw a sweet widow with polite sons. They never saw the arsenal in the basement or the wanted posters in the newspapers. Every morning Ma cooked breakfast as if they were living an ordinary life. Bacon sizzling, coffee brewing, and plans being whispered between bites. The sound of money being counted became their new lullaby. The Barker-Karpis Gang wasn't just robbing banks anymore. They were kidnapping millionaires. It was Fred Barker and Alvin Karpis who came up with the plan. Hit the wealthy where it hurt most, their wallets and their pride. The first target was William Ham, heir to the Ham's Brewery fortune in St. Paul, Minnesota, June 1933. Broad daylight. Ham was walking down the street when a car pulled up beside him. Before he could shout, he was shoved inside, blindfolded, and driven to a safe house on the outskirts of town. For 4 days the city held its breath. Then just as suddenly he was released unharmed. The ransom? $100,000, every cent paid. The gang split the money, burned the evidence, and disappeared into thin air. The FBI was furious. The newspapers called it the perfect crime, and Ma Barker, sitting quietly in the background, just smiled and poured another cup of coffee. But they weren't done. The success with Ham made them bolder. In January 1934, they went after Edward Bremer, a banker's son with political connections. The kidnapping was clean, precise, and terrifyingly efficient. Bremer's family paid $200,000 for his release, a fortune in the middle of the Depression. That ransom was their crown jewel. It also marked the beginning of the end, because this time, they didn't just steal from the rich, they humiliated them. And powerful men with bruised pride don't forget. The FBI doubled its efforts. J. Edgar Hoover himself took it personally. The Barker-Karpis Gang wasn't just another criminal outfit now. They were a national embarrassment to the Bureau. Still, for a while, life was good, if you could call it that. The gang's hideouts became little pockets of stolen paradise. Ma kept the houses tidy, making sure the curtains stayed drawn and the neighbors never saw too much. Fred and Karpis strategized over maps and newspapers. The others came and went, bringing money, guns, and stories of close calls. Sometimes they'd sit on the porch at night, watching the fireflies and listening to the cicadas hum. For a moment, it almost felt like family again. But peace never lasts long when it's built on other people's fear. As the money grew, so did the tension. Alvin Karpis was a thinker, cold and deliberate. Fred was impulsive, emotional. He trusted his mother's instincts over Karpis's logic. And that friction began to crack the gang from within. Ever the matriarch tried to keep the peace, cooking their meals, mediating their fights, scolding them like boys. But the stakes were too high now. The FBI had them in its sights, and any slip-up could mean death. Karpis started to resent Ma's influence. He said she was dead weight, that her presence made them easier to track. But Fred wouldn't hear it. "She's family," he snapped once. "She stays." That loyalty would cost them both dearly. By late 1934, the walls were closing in. The FBI was tracing ransom bills, matching fingerprints, building a web around the gang's movements. One by one, their safe houses were compromised. Herman had already met a bloody end in a police shootout years earlier. Arthur was behind bars. Lloyd was in prison too. Only Fred and Ma remained free. Traveling with Karpis and a few loyal stragglers, they drifted south, away from the frozen Midwest. Chasing warmth and anonymity, Florida. That's where they landed. Lake Weir, a quiet spot surrounded by mossy oaks and calm waters. They rented a lakeside house under the name Mr. and Mrs. Blackburn. The neighbors thought they were simple folks from Chicago looking for a bit of peace. Ma Barker loved it there. The mornings were slow, the sunsets golden. For the first time in years, she didn't have to run. She'd sit by the window, knitting or reading, while Fred and the others played cards in the back room. If she noticed the occasional strange car on the road, the men watching from a distance, she didn't let on. But the Bureau was already closing in. Behind the scenes, the FBI was piecing together the puzzle. They tracked letters, phone calls, money trails. Then came the tip, the one that pointed them straight to Lake Weir. Agents moved in quietly, surrounding the house before dawn. They wanted the gang alive if possible, but they were ready for war. Inside, Ma and Fred were having breakfast. When they heard the first call to surrender, Fred's face went pale. He turned to his mother. "They found us." Ma didn't panic. She didn't scream. She just stood, straightened her dress, and looked toward the window. "Then we'll go down together," she said. What followed became one of the most infamous standoffs in FBI history. The agents surrounded the house. Fred refused to surrender. The first shot came from inside, and for the next 4 hours, the air around Lake Weir erupted with gunfire. Bullets tore through the wooden walls, shattering windows and splintering furniture. Inside, Ma and Fred held their ground. No one knows exactly what she did. Some say she fired a weapon, others say she never touched one. But by the time the smoke cleared, both were dead. Fred's body was found near a machine gun. Ma's lay beside him, a small pistol nearby. The FBI called her the mastermind. The newspapers called her the most vicious mother in America. But those who knew her, those who remembered the girl from Missouri and the woman who fought to protect her, boys, knew the truth was far more complicated. As agents searched the wreckage, they found her Bible, still open on the table. A passage underlined in fading pencil read, "For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also." It was a fitting epitaph for a woman whose treasure had always been her sons, and whose heart had led her to ruin. The Barker-Karpis reign had ended in fire and lead, but its shadow would stretch across history. To this day, people still argue about who Ma Barker really was, a ruthless criminal or a loyal mother caught in a storm of her own making. Either way, her legend was sealed the moment that house fell silent. Morning broke over Lake Weir like any other. A soft mist rolled across the water, and the cypress trees stood motionless, their roots reaching deep into the still earth. The house the Barkers rented sat quiet beneath the shade, an unassuming lakeside cabin with white shutters and a screened porch. To the locals, it was peaceful. To the Bureau, it was a nest of outlaws. It was January 16, 1935. Inside, Fred Barker poured coffee for his mother. The smell of fried bacon filled the small kitchen. They were, for a brief moment, just mother and son again. The air was warm, calm, too calm. Because beyond the tree line, dozens of FBI agents were already moving into position. The Bureau had tracked them here after months of silence, following a chain of letters, a slip of carelessness, a whisper from someone who'd once called them friends. And now, the long manhunt that had chased the Barker name from the plains of Kansas to the streets of Chicago was ending right here, on the banks of a quiet Florida lake. At 5:30 a.m., the agents surrounded the property. The lead man, Special Agent Earl Connolly, watched the windows through binoculars. He could see movement inside, silhouettes crossing behind lace curtains. The report said there were two, Fred Barker and an elderly woman, possibly armed. He gave the order. "Let's try it peaceful first." A loudspeaker cracked the dawn stillness. "Fred Barker, Ma Barker, this is the Federal Bureau of Investigation. You're surrounded. Come out with your hands up." For a long, tense moment, there was silence. Then the curtains shifted. Fred's voice shouted back, sharp and defiant, "Go to hell." The standoff had begun. The first bullet came from the house. No one knows who fired it, Fred, Ma, or someone else entirely. But that single shot shattered any hope of negotiation. Within seconds, the air erupted with the thunder of Tommy guns and rifles. The agents ducked behind trees and cars, returning fire toward the cabin. Plumes of splintered wood burst from the walls. Inside, the furniture turned to shrapnel. The windows shattered, curtains ignited, and the hum of insects was replaced by the roar of war. Inside, Ma Barker didn't run. Witnesses later said the gunfire lasted for hours, 4 in total. The cabin became a battlefield. The Bureau unleashed everything they had. The outlaws inside returned fire with the desperation of cornered animals. But this wasn't the Midwest anymore. There was no open road to escape down, no friendly town to vanish into. Just water, trees, and the inevitable end. Neighbors along the lake heard the chaos and huddled inside their homes. They saw the flashes in the windows, the smoke rising into the morning sky. To them, it sounded like thunder that refused to stop. One man, a fisherman, later said, "It was like the devil himself was dying in that house." The agents moved closer, inch by inch, bullets snapping through the brush. One shouted, "Give up! You can't win this." But there was no answer. Only another burst of gunfire, then silence. Then, a woman's voice, calm, firm, and clear, called out from inside, "You'll never take my boys alive." It was the last thing anyone ever heard Ma Barker say. By 10:30 a.m., the cabin had gone quiet. The agents waited another half hour before approaching, weapons drawn. The door was riddled with holes, the windows blackened from smoke. When they finally stepped inside, the smell of gunpowder and wood dust hung thick in the air. Fred Barker lay near a window, a Thompson submachine gun still beside him. His body was riddled with bullets. Nearby, slumped in a rocking chair, was Ma Barker, her hands folded loosely in her lap. A small pistol at her side. She looked, one agent later said, as if she were sleeping. The scene was chaos, holes torn through the walls, furniture shredded to splinters, blood mixed with broken glass. The agents searched the house and found cash, weapons, and letters, remnants of the Barker-Karpis Gang's empire. But what struck them most wasn't the evidence. It was the stillness. For years, Ma Barker had been painted as the ruthless mother of America's most violent gang. The press called her the brains, the commanding general, the mastermind of the Midwest. And yet the woman lying dead before them didn't look like a criminal genius. She looked like someone's mother, tired, aged, and small. Edgar Hoover wasn't at Lake Weir that day, but when the report reached his desk, he knew the story had to serve a purpose. The FBI was still new, still building its reputation. The public needed to believe in the Bureau's power and to fear the outlaw's fate. So, Hoover made sure the headlines told the story his way. Emma Barker, master criminal killed in FBI shootout. That's what the papers said. Photos of the house were splashed across front pages nationwide. The image of the slain matriarch became legend overnight. To the American public, she wasn't just a mother. She was the criminal queen of the Midwest, a symbol of the outlaw era's end. But behind that official story, questions lingered. Some agents whispered that Ma had never fired a shot, that she might not have even been armed. Others said she'd been caught in her son's crossfire, a victim of loyalty rather than leadership. Alvin Karpis himself, still alive and imprisoned years later, claimed Ma was no mastermind at all. Ma Barker couldn't organize breakfast, he said. She was just an old lady who liked having her boys around. Yet even he couldn't deny her influence. Her presence had bound those men together in a way no boss or partner ever could. She was the heart of the storm, soft maybe, but unbreakable. When the gunfire ended at Lake Weir, it didn't just kill two people. It marked the death of an era. The outlaw age, the one born from prohibition, forged in back roads and bank robberies, was fading fast. The machine gun bandits and dusty hideouts were giving way to organized syndicates, polished crime, and calculated power. The Barkers had been the last of their kind, outlaws by blood, not business. Their death sent a message, loud and clear, that the romantic age of rebellion was over. From now on, crime would wear suits instead of masks, and power would move quietly, behind closed doors. In the days after the shootout, the FBI had the cabin photographed and cataloged. Curious locals came by to stare at the bullet-riddled house, whispering to one another about the woman who died fighting the law. Some said she deserved it. Others said she never stood a chance. The truth, like most legends, lay somewhere in the smoke. Later that week, the bodies of Ma and Fred Barker were taken north, laid out for identification, then buried side by side in Welch, Oklahoma. No fancy headstones, no crowds, just a plain cemetery in a small town, quiet, unassuming, and a world away from the headlines that bore their names. For all her infamy, Arizona Donnie Barker was sent off without ceremony. No choir, no flowers, just the steady whisper of wind through the grass. It was an ending that fit her life perfectly. Hard, unpolished, and wrapped in mystery. Still, one question hung over everything. Who was she, really? Was she a calculating matriarch, commanding her sons from the shadows? Or just a mother too loyal to see what her love had become? History never decided. Maybe it never could. Because the truth about Ma Barker wasn't written in court records or police reports. It was written in the choices of a woman who refused to abandon her family, even when it led her straight into hell. When the sun set over Lake Weir that evening, the wind carried the faint echo of that gunfire through the trees. The lake was still again. The ripples faded. The cabin stood silent, but for years after, locals swore they could still hear it sometimes. The distant sound of a Tommy gun on the breeze, and the voice of a woman calling out to her boys, a mother's last stand, forever carved into the waters of Florida. They say time has a way of sanding down the rough edges of truth. What begins as a life lived in flesh and blood becomes, over the decades, a legend, half rumor, half remembrance. Arizona Donnie Barker's story is no different. For some, she remains Ma Barker, the cold-blooded criminal matriarch who directed her sons into a life of violence. For others, she was just a mother, flawed, loyal, and desperate to keep her family together in a world that kept tearing them apart. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between. When the gunfire at Lake Weir finally faded, the newspapers wasted no time painting her as the evil mastermind. Headlines screamed about the mother of crime. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover himself declared that Ma Barker was the most dangerous woman in America. It made for good copy, a fearsome matriarch controlling a clan of killers. The image stuck like a brand, burned into public imagination. But the real question whispered beneath all that noise was simple. Was it true? Those who knew her, neighbors and kin, told a different tale. They said she wasn't clever enough to plan a bank robbery, let alone an empire of crime. They said she cooked, cleaned, and waited while her boys ran wild, loving them too fiercely to turn them away. But love can be blinding, and loyalty, misplaced, can destroy as surely as betrayal. Perhaps Ma wasn't the architect of evil, but a woman swept up in the storm her sons created. Still, she never ran. She never betrayed them. Even in the end, surrounded by gunfire, she stayed. That, in a strange and terrible way, became her power. Over time, her story was twisted and retold on movie screens, in dime novels and crime documentaries. Sometimes she's portrayed as a cunning criminal strategist, other times as a tragic mother figure caught between love and law. But maybe the fascination endures because Ma Barker embodies something more primal, something about the boundaries of motherhood and how far a person will go to protect their own. In the quiet spaces between fact and fiction, you can almost see her sitting by a window in that lakeside house, her hair pinned up neatly, a small revolver resting beside her tea, the morning sun spilling through the curtains. She's not the roaring outlaw the headlines made her out to be. She's tired. Her life's work, if you can call it that, has come full circle. All the money, the hideouts, the loyalty, it led her here. To this silence before the storm. There's a moment in every legend where the human story is lost to the myth. For Arizona Donnie Barker, that moment came the second the bullets stopped flying. Once her body was found, the myth was born. People needed a symbol, a face to attach to the fear of organized crime. Ma Barker fit the role too perfectly, the mother-turned-monster. A warning to anyone who thought they could challenge the order of things. But history, when viewed closely, tells a different kind of truth. It suggests that the FBI may have exaggerated her role to justify the bloodshed, that she may have been caught in a crossfire she didn't command, that her greatest crime was not her leadership, but her loyalty. Even today, when historians dig through old files and yellowed clippings, they find inconsistencies, letters that show affection, not strategy. Notes from her sons that sound less like soldiers reporting to a general and more like boys writing home to a mother. "Love you, Ma," they wrote. "Be safe." It's easy to forget that behind the headlines were people, poor, desperate, shaped by the Great Depression's merciless grip. They lived on the fringes of society, where opportunity was scarce and survival demanded compromise. For the Barkers, crime became both rebellion and necessity, and for Ma, it became a form of family unity, a way to keep her boys close in a world intent on tearing families apart. Her story, tragic as it is, forces us to look at the gray in a world that prefers black and white. Was she a mastermind or merely a mother lost in her son's sins? Was she complicit or simply incapable of letting go? These are questions that have no clear answers, and maybe that's why her legend still lingers like smoke in the American imagination. As the years rolled on, her name became shorthand for criminal motherhood. Ma Barker entered folklore beside Jesse James, Bonnie and Clyde, and Dillinger, figures who blurred the line between outlaw and celebrity. But there's something lonelier about her story. Because when you strip away the myth, what remains isn't glamour or defiance, it's loss. A mother lost her sons, a woman lost her life, a family lost its name, and yet, in that loss, there's a strange kind of immortality. The Barker name survived, not as it once was, but as a cautionary tale told around the fires of history. Every time her story is retold, someone asks, who was Ma Barker really? And in that question she lives again, part woman, part legend, and wholly unforgettable. Maybe that's what she wanted all along. Not fame, not power, but remembrance. To matter in a world that often forgot women like her, the Midwest still holds echoes of her tale. Old houses with boarded windows, cracked roads leading to forgotten towns, whispers of gunfire in the stillness of morning. Somewhere in that silence, the spirit of Arizona Donnie Barker lingers, not as the villain Hoover made her out to be, but as a symbol of loyalty twisted by desperation. Her story reminds us that sometimes evil wears a familiar face, not because it chooses to, but because it cannot bear to let go of love. And as the credits of her life roll across the backdrop of America's lawless past, one truth remains. Every legend is born from someone who refused to stay ordinary. Ma Barker may have died behind a wall of bullets, but her myth lived on, shaped by storytellers, feared by history, and remembered by those who see both the mother and the monster. The world never quite decided which one she truly was. So the next time you hear her name whispered in the dark corners of true crime lore, think of the woman behind it, the one who walked the fine line between love and law, right and wrong, family and fate. Because in the end, that's what all great gangster stories really are, reflections of our own choices, our own hungers, our own desire to be remembered. And if you enjoyed this story, this descent into the shadows of the past, make sure to subscribe for more tales from the underworld. There are still many legends waiting to be told, and not all of them ended in gunfire. Some just faded quietly, leaving behind only a name like Ma Barker.